Hey, this is Mitch from Castro Valley Fitness. How you doing today? A couple weeks ago, I wrote in an email to try to make everything a hip exercise or a shoulder blade or lat exercise. And a few people weren't quite sure what that meant. So we're going to talk about that today. We're going to cover it pretty quickly, although it's kind of a deeper topic. So as far as common complaints that people have, we talk a lot about shoulder pain, back pain, shoulder tightness, neck tightness, tight hips, just kind of general pain, general movement, and things like that. So we talk a lot about here about how to use your hip position and your shoulder position to engage your core better, which takes the pressure off of your shoulders and your low back. Okay, so that's what we're going to talk about today. So we're going to talk about your hips, how to move them and how to stabilize them, and same thing with your shoulder blades, not necessarily your shoulders. So when people think about shoulders, they think a lot about this up here. We want to think about shoulder blade kind of area right back there. Okay, so let's get started. Okay, so we're going to start by talking about the hips. Now, the first thing to understand is that for your core to function properly, your hips have to be in a good position. Your core, most people think of their core as their six-pack right up there. The core actually is all of this, okay? And to a large extent, your glutes as well. But in order for that core to function, the hips have to be in a good place, okay? So a couple ways to do that. What I like to tell people is grab your fingers, kind of poke your sides a little bit, push out. You're going to feel that tension through here, and watch what happens to my hip position when I do that. So if I'm like this is not a particularly good position. Pour in here. So did you see how I kind of straightened up? I did not try to do that. By engaging that core, the hips wind up where they're supposed to wind up. So I'm going to look at this in relation to two different exercises: a squat where your hips are moving, and an overhead press in which they are not moving. Okay? But apply either of these things to every single exercise you do to get your position correct. So for a squat, first thing we want to do when we're squatting is we want to move our hips back. Okay? So when we talk about what happens in our low back and our knees if we do not squat properly, if our hips do not move back and forth properly, what's going to happen is you're going to put a lot of tension on your knees, and also when the knees go forward like this, in order for your body to stabilize, your back's going to kind of be round because you're just off balance, okay? So when we're squatting, we want to focus on how our hips move by moving them back and down, okay? Now by doing that, I'm allowing my core to engage. I'm taking the pressure off my low back, off my knees. Push hips back, get down, okay? So notice also how my upper body stays nice and tall, okay? So that's kind of how to move your hips. That's pretty easy to kind of understand. The next part is a little harder to understand, and that's how your hips operate on an exercise where they're not even moving. So let's take an overhead press, okay? So a lot of people, they just kind of we're going to use a band because I had a band handy. So a lot of people will just grab the band and just start going, okay? And there's a lot of this kind of action, okay? So what I want to do is, when I'm thinking about stabilizing, I'm going to lock my hips in. I'm going to get in this position. I'm going to set my core just like I showed you before. And then from here, I'm going to press, and I'm going to concentrate on keeping my hips steady, okay? Again, I don't want a back and forth here. I want to keep them steady. So I'm going to focus my position, or my concentration on keeping that hip position locked in. So that's how I'm making this a hip exercise. By keeping my hips locked in, I'm actually allowing my core to engage, okay? So again, this applies to every exercise. For every exercise you're doing, your hips are either moving or they're not. So if they are moving, then apply it. Then it's pretty self-explanatory. But if they're not, take an extra second during your setup to engage that core, lock your hips in place, and you're going to find yourself in a much better position as far as your low back and your knees, okay? So now we're going to talk about shoulders. Okay, so now we're going to talk about shoulders. Same kind of thing. I'm going to show you how they should move and how they should stabilize, depending on the exercise that you're doing. Because again, every exercise you're doing is going to involve either stabilization or movement throughout up there. And again, I want to point this out, I said it before, but when we're talking about shoulders, I'm not necessarily talking about this. I'm talking about more shoulder blade area for our purposes for this discussion, okay? Because your shoulder blades are actually a really important stabilizer for your entire back, okay? When you lock in your shoulder blades, it is actually really hard for me, if not impossible, to round my back, okay? Rounding your back is a position you don't want to be in too often. Obviously, you need to do that sometimes for various things, but you don't want to do it very often. So if you're picking something up, being able to stabilize there is going to help you lock that straight back position in, okay? That's really important. So let's talk about movement first with just a real basic shoulder exercise, a row. So how are my shoulders supposed to move during a row? They're supposed to retract. So that first movement here, how are my shoulders supposed to move here? The first movement of a row is shoulder blades down and back, and then finish the move with the elbow, okay? So I say this a lot in here, rows are not an arm exercise, okay? Rows are not an arm exercise, they're a back exercise. That's pretty easy to understand, okay? What's a little harder to understand is how to make something like a squat or a deadlift a shoulder exercise. So I'm gonna show you. So let's say we're doing a goblet squat here, okay? So we're holding the kettlebell here, okay? There's a couple of different ways. I'm gonna kind of show you. There's a couple of different ways to hold it. This way, I got my shoulders locked in, I'm nice and tall. And by locking them in, I mean I'm kind of pulling them back just a little bit, feeling a little bit of tension. Or I could completely forget my shoulders and then I'm kind of hunched like this. Or I'm just kind of holding them like this, okay? This is kind of a very common thing if you're doing a lot of typing. We don't want that. We want to pull them back and down. So when I'm squatting, I want my back to stay straight. So I'm going to pull my shoulders back and down, okay? For a deadlift, watch the difference here in my back, my low back, depending on what my shoulders do. So if I do a deadlift here and my shoulders are locked in, my back is straight. If I let my shoulders round, see how my back rounds. Pull it back, straight. Round, my back rounds. So again, just like with hips, try to think about what are my shoulders supposed to be doing? What are my shoulder blades? I keep saying shoulders, I mean shoulder blades. What are my shoulder blades supposed to be doing during this exercise? And what are my hips supposed to be doing during these exercises? If you think about that for every exercise you do, whether it's a push-up or a bench press or a squat or a deadlift or a row or a plank or anything, then you're going to find yourself in a much better position to get the most out of that exercise and take the pressure off your back, your knees, your shoulders, your neck, this whole thing. Because this and this and this are really important and probably the areas of the body that are most important to get your core, which is the center of the whole thing, engaged. And if you get that engaged, everything's working a lot better. So if you have any questions, I know this is kind of complicated. I kind of ran through it. Might have been rambling a little bit, but that's just who I am. So if you have any questions, just send me an email and I will answer them and kind of demonstrate further. But there we are. Thank you. Have a great day.